The first question that I want to ask you is about the politics of the Ramayana. The Ramayana, out of all the Hindu texts, Ramayana is one you worked with the most. Your book on Hanuman, right? So I want to ask you about the politics of the Ramayana, the politics of the Bajrang Dal, and what you found out. Were there any startling discoveries in that area when you went about working for your book?
And you want me to speak specifically about the Hanuman book, Hanuman's Tale,
The Hanuman
and not
book
about
is-
my earlier book?
Your earlier book and
Okay.
right.
So let me start with the earlier book.
Right.
My first book is called The Life of a Text.
Right.
And it was published in India, but long ago and went out of print.
Right.
And it's a study of the popularity of the Tulsidas Ramcharitmanas, the Ramcharitmanas.
Right. The Ramcharitmanas.
How it became the very powerful and preeminent text that it is today.
Right.
And so it's a kind of a biography of the book.
Right.
That's why I called it The Life of a Text. I've sometimes said in Hindi, Granth Ka Jivan Charitra.
Right.
And it's a 400-year study. It includes historical dimensions, socio-political dimensions, a lot on cultural performance, things like Ram Leela, Ramayana Katha. The last chapter is called The Text in a Changing Society.
Right.
I basically draw a contrast between what I would call basically a Gandhian interpretation of Ramraj, which is a kind of liberation theology, albeit somewhat vague. But Gandhi's idea, particularly in his Hindi language discourse, that Ramraj represented Loktantra, democracy, grassroots, uplift, social activism. There's a quote from Gandhiji that I use where he says, Ramraj is rule of the people.
Right.
A person like Rama would never wish to rule.
Right.
And that was his so to say, bhav, his feeling about the Ramayana. So the Ramayana can be worked by both camps and has been. Right. So that's a very interesting thing about the Ramayana tradition as a whole.
When you're saying worked by both camps, could you elaborate on that a bit?
For example, Swami, I believe his name was Swami Sahajananda. I may be getting his name wrong. There was a grassroots peasant revolt leader in Bihar in the 1920s who was a Ramanandi sadhu.
Right.
And a leftist, absolute leftist.
Right.
And he, used the manas all the time in his discourses. I mean, that was his medium of thought and expression. He was always quoting Tulsidas. But he had very radical political ideas. And then on the other hand, you have very orthodox, industrial strength Brahmin interpretation of the text where, that highlights other passages, of course. Okay, so does that make sense?
That makes sense. Just a little bit more elaboration here, which is that the connection of, if you can exemplify that a bit more, where there is a radical view and given legitimacy by passages from the Manas, like you were speaking about. If you could just exemplify that with one example, it would make it a lot more clearer.
Oh God, I don't have a quote that jumps readily to mind. Of course, one of my own favorite chopais is Parahita Sare Sadharama Nahi Bhai, Parapirda Sama Nahi Adhamai. Now that is said by Ram himself to Bharat in Book 7. Parahita Sare Sadharama Nahi Bhai. There is no dharma like helping others, like doing the well-being of others. No dharma equivalent to that. And there is no lowness, adamai, which means nichita, lowness. There is no lowness equivalent to causing pain or suffering to others. If you take that seriously, that's a very high ethical ideal, similar to the kind of notion of the golden rule, So there are verses like that.
So this was the interpretation. Here, Philip, I want to ask you a question. Could you give us an instance of the misinterpretation of the Ramayana, where you feel that there has been a misinterpretation? It's a text you work with deeply. You've also judged it, or you've seen it gauged it in context, in the current day context of the Indian people?
You're not going to like my answer. I don't, I'm standing a little bit outside the tradition.
Right.
I don't present myself as a Ramayana Bhakta,
right,
or even as a Hindu.
right,
And I look at the text as a scholar and as a lover of literature and a lover of India and Indian culture. There are many things about it that I love, but I don't feel that I have to love everything about it, nor do I feel that I have to defend it against its quite a few detractors. And I don't feel I have to invent tortuous explanations for certain verses that are critical of women or critical of Shudras,
the lower castes,
which are all too famous and notorious nowadays. It's the product of a 16th century poet who was shaped by his own milieu. I could point out many instances in which he apparently contradicts those assertions, and I have in my book. I can't bring them immediately to my lips offhand. But I do show that almost every such assertion is balanced by others that can be read quite differently. But as far as saying that this person here is misinterpreting the Ramayana, I don't consider that my task to do. There are so many innumerable interpreters and interpretations of the text, and that's true of a great work of literature. It's
you
open.
Can't say this interpretation is false or wrong.
Yeah, and particularly if it's by someone who is deeply steeped in the tradition, which I'm not. I'm a relative. I've been reading it for 30 years. I know people that know it by heart and have been reading it, for 70 years. And who am I to say? I may disagree with their interpretation, but I won't say that it's wrong. Okay. Or I may prefer a slightly different interpretation.
Coming to your second book.
So should we go back to your original question related
Let's go back
to the second book? So my second book is about Hanuman. It's called Hanuman's Tale, T-A-L-E. The Messages of a Divine Monkey is the subtitle. Studying the Ramayana and living in Benares for a long time and studying Tulsidas, naturally you get fascinated by Hanuman. Hanuman is everywhere, and in a very real sense, is the most popular character in the Ramayana. Which is something that I talk about a lot in the book. So that's what led me into that project. And it became a huge project. I worked on that book for over 16 years. And part of it was about a year and a half of research in India, but a lot of it was just digesting the material that I collected in that time. And then people sending me stuff. People continually sending me more and more material and information, more temples that I had to visit.
So much because
everyone wants to talk about Hanuman, and that's great, and I love that. And then I'm currently working on another project.
And that's the reason. That was one of the reasons also that you wrote the book. The fact that he was such a popular god even in today's time.
So the theme of the book is sort of why is Hanuman one of the most beloved deities, and yet Western scholars, particularly of Hinduism generally, call him a minor god. And often don't even mention him, or he gets put in a footnote if you read a sort of an intro to Hinduism book, that kind of thing. So what's this sort of striking contrast between a kind of text-based notion of Hinduism where you have the Vedas and the Puranas and the epics, and Hanuman shows up as a minor character in one epic, versus this on-the-ground reality where in Jaipur on practically every street corner, and in Benares on every street corner, and in between there's Hanuman. So he's obviously a lok devata, and he's very much a deity of the people, and that appealed to me. And there are several arguments that run through the book, and it's a long book. It's about 400 pages. And there are several arguments that are developed through different chapters. Historical chapter on literature, chapter on stories. There are 2 chapters devoted to popular stories about Hanuman, including the one that I told in my little talk yesterday. And then a last chapter, which again, sort of as in Life of a Text, kind of looks at Hanuman's role in a bigger socio-political context, especially in the 20th century. So one of the arguments running through the book is that Hanuman historically has very often been associated with lower class and lower caste communities. And he has been a deity who has been sort of the people, of the larger mass of the people, and not an elite deity. There are no major temples to Hanuman that date back more than 300 or 400 years. No large temples, no royally patronized temples, no significant complexes. And even his iconography, except in friezes that depict Ramayana stories that you start finding from the Gupta period on, but freestanding images of just Hanuman alone, such as we are all familiar with today, they really don't start till around 11th, 12th century, and even then just a few. And it really is after that. So I look at that development, and the reigning explanation for this that you find in Hindi language scholarship and a very little bit of English language scholarship, because actually very little was written about Hanuman. But one explanation that I found repeatedly is that, it's all because of the Muslims. The coming of the Muslims and the oppression of the Hindus, and Hanuman is a protector deity, and therefore the Hindus rallied around Hanuman as their protector. This is a kind of, I call it a master narrative, because it occurs in quite a number of places. And many people will repeat that to you as a kind of obvious fact. And scholars always like to look at obvious facts and say, well, what if we looked from a slightly different angle? What if this wasn't quite so obvious? So what I do in my historical chapter is I look at 3 important historical moments where there's an obvious proliferation of Hanuman iconography and texts and worship. 3 particular historical periods. One is the Vijayanagar Empire. One is the Maratha, early Maratha period. And one is the Ramanandi sadhus in the 17th and 18th century. And in each case, I look at alternative explanations, and I find, in fact, very little evidence that it had anything at all to do with Muslims or Islam or a threatening other culture. But it had a lot to do with lower caste groups, what we would today call lower caste groups, peasant caste groups, coming into access to new kinds of self-expression and power, and starting to do more visible patronage, religious patronage. The evidence is very striking for Vijayanagar, particularly.
In what way? Could you elucidate on that a bit? When you're saying lower caste groups, for example, for the entire Muslim narrative, which you're sort of talking against, or you're saying that you wanted to go beyond that, right? The Muslim narrative that you heard. But there was this whole thing about him being a protector god. There was this talk about him being a protector god, and therefore it was Hanuman that became the important god. When we're talking about the lower castes coming in and adopting Hanuman as their god, then what would be the reason that you would see that? For what reason? Why Hanuman?
I'm not proposing that the lower castes suddenly adopt Hanuman as their god. I'm saying that, in fact, they may well have been worshipping him for quite some time. But they are suddenly coming into a position of being able to build little shrines, build temples, commission 8-foot images, such as the 1,000 images that are found in Vijayanagar. Almost none of which have inscriptions on them, which is a sign that they were not patronized by elite groups. Almost none of them have roofs over them. So again, this is suggestive of something that's coming from, so to say, the people. I'm using this term a bit carelessly. Please understand that these arguments are developed a lot more subtly in the book, and there's only so much that I can say in a conversation like this.
Talk. Right.
But there is a great deal of evidence, and I try to present it.
Right.
And so I critique this master narrative that Hanuman is a reaction to Muslim oppression.
Right.
And I suggest that in fact he's connected always with what I term somewhat playfully upward mobility.
Right.
Hanuman is himself an upwardly mobile god.
Right.
If you think of all the images of him as an infant soaring into the sky, reaching for the sun, and being chastised by Indra and the other gods, and then getting more powerful than them.
Right.
Or you think of the images of him with Ram and Lakshman on his shoulders, soaring up from Patal Lok, from the netherworld, after rescuing them from Ehiravana.
Right.
Or soaring with the mountain, holding the mountain peak, bringing the Sanjeevani for Lakshman.
Right.
He's a deity who is in motion, who is, powerful. He also has this other side. He has this bhakti side, this devotional shant side. And I talk about the tension between Shakti and Bhakti in his worship in the book. And the Bhakti side is sometimes preferred by more status conscious and status quo, maintaining status quo kind of authors and groups.
Right. There's this story that does the rounds in Varanasi, which says that Hanuman is a Chiranjeevi.
Yeah,
which says that he is still alive and amongst us. So where do you think that came from? Where do you feel that came from?
It's in the book.
Right, exactly.
There's a big section
I'm going to, at the end of this interview, I'm going to ask something about the book as well. But this is for people who can't read the book right now. Right.
Sure.
That's why I want to ask you this.
I don't remember offhand the earliest textual.
Right.
Well, no, of course I do. It comes from the Valmiki Ramayana.
Right.
Because 3 times, I think, in the Valmiki Ramayana, Hanuman gets blessed with Chiranjeevatva or Amaratva by Ram, by Sita, maybe twice by Ram.
Right.
So, he's kind of overdetermined immortal. I mean, he's plenty immortal.
Right.
But again, the significance of this in the wider picture is that Hanuman achieves immortality by his own efforts.
Right.
He's a self-made man.
Right.
Or monkey.
Right. Right.
And again, this is a kind of an empowering image, I think.
Right.
Yes, he is absolutely Chiranjeevi, and I have a whole section about people encountering him, and
all these
experiences, and him temporarily taking form in various places. And, that's a big
Could you
theme.
narrate one of those real life experiences? I'm asking you again because a lot of our viewers would not be able to read your book. But could you narrate one of those real life experiences, which would be more interesting than the tales which we read about the stories we read about Hanuman?
This is a story. This is a story that many of the stories in my book come from Hindi language. Inexpensive books that you buy in the bazaar. Hanuman Jeevan Charitra, Hanuman Leela, Hanuman Leelamrita, things like that, and 2 novels, 2 autobiographical novels in Hindi in which Hanuman narrates his own life story, which I find very fascinating. Atmakathas. So, but those, of course, some of your viewers or listeners might have access to. But I'll narrate a story that absolutely nobody knows, because it's about a Gora, it's about a Videshi. This is a gentleman who I met in the United States who was living for a long time in Vrindavan because he was a devotee of a particular guru there, and he was also a devotee of Hanuman. And it so happens that one day in the 1980s, he had gone across the Yamuna to have darshan of some sant at some ashram there. And with him were 2 young American women who were also, bhaktas. They were Hare Krishna people or something. And they ended up staying a little bit too late
right.
at this ashram, and it became dark,
right.
and they had to go back
right.
across the Yamuna. And they got to the bridge, and there was somebody there who said, you know, there are dakus in the area, Tora Khatarnak, you know, you shouldn't go. But they really wanted to get back to Vrindavan. They didn't have any place to stay. So they started out across the bridge, and it was a moonlit night, but still dark. And as they were partway across the bridge, they saw this this band of young men coming towards them who didn't look too good.
Right.
Yeah, it looked like there could be trouble. And in fact, at a certain point, these young men started running towards them, making threatening gestures and sounds. And this gentleman, who I think was about 35, 40 at the time.
Right. Around about how far back was this? How many
80s.
80s,
yeah.
right.
Yeah, I don't...
Right, around about the 80s,
yeah.
right. Sorry, this gentleman.
He said, without really knowing what he was doing or why, he raised his arms and he shouted, Bajranga Bali ki jai.
Right.
And he started running towards these men. And he really said, I sort of lost all awareness of myself. But I felt as if I was very, very big.
Right.
And as he ran towards these men, they turned around and they fled.
Right.
And they fled so fast that several of them lost their shoes.
Right.
They were later found on the bridge.
That's a pretty crazy story.
And then, but it gets even better.
Right.
The next morning, he heard from some Babas who had seen this from the riverbank that they saw Hanuman chasing these gundas across the bridge.
Right.
Yeah.
This is pretty insane.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's a close encounter of the third kind or fourth kind, perhaps.
Right. The next question that I really want to ask you is that when you started out, when you came here and you started work in these projects, right, yours, what was the opposition? What were the biggest challenges you encountered? Because one would imagine that you would encounter a lot of challenge because people would be like, coming from sections who would say, why do you want to write this book? What right do you have? You are not from here. Those sort of questions. Did you encounter any such challenges, firstly? And if you did, then how did you overcome them?
Quite honestly, Rishi, no.
No?
Very, very rare.
Right. That's good to hear.
Yeah.
That's nice to hear.
In Benares, people were extraordinarily welcoming.
Right.
And in my first book, I had the good fortune to begin it just at the time of the Ram Leela.
Right.
Begin the work.
Right.
And I went to the Ramnagar Ram Leela for the whole 31 days.
Right.
And I sat with the Ramayanis and I chanted along with them. And within 2 or 3 days, they were very, very accepting and welcoming, and I was just kind of part of the group.
It's very encouraging to hear.
And then that experience allowed me to meet a huge number of people in the Benares area who were connected with the Ramayana, because everybody came at some point or other to the Ram Leela.
Right.
And later on, every now and then, I'd be in a new place and I'd be going to interview a new Vyas or something, and somebody would say, who is this guy? What does he want to know about?
Right.
And people sometimes are suspicious. And then somebody would say, no, he was at Ramnagar.
Right.
Niyam se.
Right.
For the whole month.
Right.
And everyone, so that was like my passport,
Right.
But on the whole, people were lovely, they were welcoming, they were excited that I was interested.
Right.
So I really didn't have that problem. The problem that I had was of an entirely different sort, which was making people understand what it was that I was studying.
Right.
And I've put it like, explaining to people in Benares that you're studying the oral performance of the Ramayana is like trying to explain to fish that you're studying water.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
This was something that was so much a part of their everyday life and their everyday experience that they didn't think of it as something that anybody would want to look at.
Right.
And so everyone would keep saying to me, oh, you need to read books about the Ramayana.
Right.
Oh, my uncle has written the book.
Right.
or my, you know,
right.
my mother's
Give
cousin
you a lot of
brother
paper.
has written the definitive philosophical study of Tulsidas, and you must read that. And these things are all good and fine, but that's not what I was studying. I was studying the oral tradition. By which the Ramayana, a text, you know, written in around 1574, when most of the population was completely illiterate. How did it become this household entity and this everyday phenomenon in the culture?
Right. Thank you so much, Philip. One last quick question, which is your second book, which everyone is looking forward to read, but we cannot find it in India. It's not been published in India. What's the reason for that?
It is not published in India. It's published by Oxford University Press, USA. And it's in paperback, but it's not available in India. And इसके बारे में एक रामायण है, लेकिन अभी तो मैं नहीं कह सकता.
Right. Thank you so much, Philip.